Hi, this is S.G. Brownlow. Today I'd like to answer a question that several people have asked me in various ways. What's this about sensitive introverts? Are there such a thing as sensitive extroverts? Could somebody be a shy extrovert or an outgoing introvert? The answer is yes, but let me answer that question not from my opinion, but really from psychology. And from the people who really study personality psychology in particular. So the way to maybe explain this a little bit is that in psychology, one of the things that's just true is that everything correlates with everything, but usually the correlations are pretty weak. And so if I know how somebody does or how a group of people do on one variable, I can predict something about how they'll do on another related variable, but usually my predictions are going to be good for maybe a 10% accuracy at most. It's not very good, but it's going to tell me a little something. And so if you can only predict 10%, it gives you something, but it doesn't give you very much. Now, with a few variables that are really tightly correlated, then maybe knowing how a group of people do on one variable might tell you even 50% of how they do on another variable, or even 60% maybe. And so that's when, by the time you get up to those kind of correlations, you're really looking at things that are pretty closely related to each other. Now, there's a technique, a statistical technique that's used in psychology sometimes called factor analysis. And basically what factor analysis is that they dump all sorts of information, measurements on a lot of different variables. They just kind of dump it into a big pot, and they see what correlates with what and how strong the correlations are. And because what they're doing is they're looking for underlying factors, as they call it. There's maybe one factor might have a correlation with another one where it explains, it may explain maybe 60 or 70% of a lot of different things. Variance might be explained by one underlying factor. And so then the idea is that if you know what those underlying factors are, you can explain most of how personality is set up, or most of how anything is set up. In this case, personality. So what the personality psychologists did, and several of them got involved in this, and it's been replicated a number of times, but what they did is they went in and they took sort of all the data that they had on personality and all the different measurements of a lot of different people, and they dumped it all in one big hopper, and they looked for common factors in the data. Now, the way it works is the more common factors you are, the more data you can explain, but at some point you kind of run out of how useful they are. So one factor may explain some big chunk of the data usually, but then if you have two, that explains more, and if you have three, that explains more. And so different people propose different solutions to this. Maybe three factors would account for some, but five factors accounted for more. And then there were some people who came up with seven factors, and seven factors accounted for even more. But one of the problems with coming up with factors in that way is you have to figure out what they are. You have to manipulate them mathematically, and there's different ways to do that. But even once you find the factor, you have to figure out what it is that factor is measuring. And so what happened in personality, they did this for a while, because there were a lot of people who had different ideas about personality and a lot of measures of personality. But what finally everybody agreed on was that the best solution was that there were five major factors. And if you don't remember those factors, the acronym is OCEAN, OCEAN will help you remember what those 5 factors are. So O is, and this is not in the order of how big they are, how significant they are, but O is openness to experience. So an example of that are like there's some people who they eat the same thing at the same time every day and they won't try anything new. Those people are not very open, at least to food. You know, some people are just constant adventurers. They're new food, new experience, new everything. Those people are very open. Okay. C is conscientiousness. And that really means that people do what they say they're going to do. When they commit to something, they follow through. And so obviously, if you have somebody working for you, if you're contracting somebody, you really want a conscientious person. You want them to follow through and do what they say they're going to do and do a good job of it all the time. Okay, E is extroversion. And extroversion was actually one of the 2 big factors, extroversion and introversion. It's opposite. And we've talked a little bit about extroversion and introversion before, but it really, when it boils down to, do I get my meaning from other people or do I get my meaning from myself? Is it other people's feedback that gives me meaning in life, or is it my own experience of life that helps me find meaning and purpose? And that's really the difference between extroversion and introversion. So that's OCE. A is agreeableness. And so an agreeable person is someone who just gets along really well with everybody. They're sort of everybody's friend. They don't necessarily take a strong stand in anything. They get along with people. And N is neuroticism. And neuroticism is it's the other of the 2 really big factors. And so extroversion and neuroticism explain a lot of things. And neuroticism is one of those things that's really kind of hard to put into words, except it really seems to have a lot to do with how well regulated and how adaptively people deal with their emotions. And so neuroticism is really about emotional health as much as anything. And so when you get to this question of can somebody be an outgoing introvert or a shy extrovert, what you really find is that outgoingness and shyness really don't have to do with introversion, extroversion. They really are much more heavily weighted with neuroticism. That someone who is shy typically is someone who is more poorly regulated emotionally, and they have more emotional conflicts when they're around other people than someone who is not shy. Okay, so when you're looking at the factors, the factor that determines whether someone is introverted or extroverted, and the one that determines whether they're shy or outgoing, are really 2 different factors. And so that's why it's very easy for me to say that yes, someone can be a shy extrovert or someone can be an outgoing introvert. In my own experience, I think as I've gotten older, I've become more and more introverted. I depend less and less on what other people think. I really don't. I listen to them because I could always be wrong, but I weigh what other people tell me against my own experience to determine what's true and what's not true about me. But at the same time, I've become, I think, a lot more outgoing as I've gotten older. When I was younger, it was very difficult for me to be outgoing sometimes because, frankly, other people's emotions would kind of override mine. And that was a regulation problem. That was a problem of empathy on my part, which is really an adaptation problem. It was an adaptation problem. And so you would think that that would fit under neuroticism more than under introversion and extroversion, which in fact it did. So that's just sort of a practical example of how to apply a lot of psychological theory. I hope it helped. If you're somebody who struggles with being a shy extrovert or struggling with being more outgoing because of your sensitivity and because of you really feel like other people are impinging on you and trying to define you, then consider giving me a shout. Email me. Let's talk about it. Let's see what we can do to help you. And until next week, this is S.G. Brownlow. Have a great week.